Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeremiah Hurley, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at McMaster. Welcome. Before we begin our proceedings, however, I'd like to acknowledge that tonight we gather on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee peoples, within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We must remember that we all have a role in upholding the spirit of this agreement, which encouraged the peaceful sharing of the Earth's resources. And we must recognize that this acknowledgement is only a small step in our shared path towards reconciliation. So again, welcome to tonight, Choice 2024, the U.S. election and its implications for Canada, hosted by McMaster's Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement, which is a joint initiative of the faculties of Humanities and Social Sciences. And tonight's panel will feature speakers and faculty members from both faculties. Tonight's event offers an exciting opportunity to explore the upcoming U.S. election, now only 2 weeks away at this moment, and why it matters for Canada. Tonight also embodies the kinds of dynamic, forward-thinking conversations that will define McMaster's Wilson College in the years to come. The issues that we tackle tonight are the types of challenges that Wilson College students, scholars, and partners will engage with in the coming years. Thanks to the remarkable generosity of Red Wilson, whose gift has enabled the creation of Wilson College, Wilson College will become a magnet for both aspiring and accomplished leaders committed to fostering a strong civic culture in Canada. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming David Farrar, President and Vice Chancellor of McMaster University, who will introduce tonight's panelists.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you all for joining us here this evening, both in person and online. There's almost double the number of people online who are here. Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and concerns are about the upcoming U.S. election, you're here tonight because you care about what's about to happen on November the 5th. You care about what many people have called the most consequential election in our lifetime, and you care about its impacts on Canada. Tonight, Professor Don Abelson, Director of Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement, Karen Bird, Professor of Political Science, and Terry Flynn, Professor of Communication Studies and Media Studies, will unpack the political, economic, social, democratic, and human rights dimensions of the U.S. election. I'd like to thank Don, Karen, and Terry for being here tonight and for taking part in this important event, and I know it will be a fascinating conversation. One of our key priorities at McMaster is supporting and advancing healthy democracies, good governance, civil society, and effective leadership. In a digital world of minute-by-minute information and misinformation, we continue to seek truth and knowledge and examine history through a scholarly lens. The Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement is the first learning and research space of its kind in Canada and will be pivotal in building the next generation of community leaders who are prepared to take on societal challenges with creativity and innovation. We're deeply grateful to all of our donors, especially Chancellor Emeritus Red Wilson and the Wilson Foundation, for their extraordinary vision and generosity, which has made the launch of Wilson College and the building of the teaching and research expertise in this critical area. So I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, McMaster graduate, former MSU chair, Giancarlo Duray. Giancarlo is the Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relations in the Office of the Ministry of the Solicitor General and a member of the External Advisory Council of Wilson College. Please join me in welcoming Giancarlo.
Thanks very much, David. Very kind of you. Kind introduction. How's everybody doing? I hope you're excited. We have a big, exciting event for you tonight. The way this is going to work, I'm going to set the stage a little bit for you, tell you what you can expect, try and gauge your feelings, your thoughts coming into this evening. I'm going to do another quick introduction of our panelists. I'm going to give a couple minutes to each of our panelists to share with you some of the key big ideas that they have bringing into this evening. And then I'm going to ask them some questions. And then we're also going to make sure we have a chance to get some questions from you folks as well. We have some that we've gotten earlier. I think there will be an opportunity as well for folks to share questions as we're rolling. So without further ado, really excited for this event put on by Wilson College. As was mentioned earlier, Wilson College is it's going to be a first of its kind learning and research space in Canada. Really excited about this. And we're all here to talk about the presidential election in 2024. As was mentioned, one of the most consequential elections in our lifetime, as a lot of folks have been talking about, a lot of weight on the shoulders coming into this evening. It's a big election, not just for America, but here for Canada as well. We're the biggest trading partner of the US. We're very connected to a number of US policies, everything from competitiveness on the global stage to our economy. And this election isn't just about policy. It's also about disinformation. It's about a growing unease around the integrity of the electoral process. It's about the American dream. It's about hope and fear. And as we watch how all this is going to unfold and how it's going to impact us, no matter how we feel about the US, we're not picking up Canada and moving to a different continent. We're here to stay. And so we're going to talk about that. How do we prepare for stability, unpredictability, all of the above? And our panelists today, who we're very lucky to have with us, are going to help us talk about what's at stake, talk about how it impacts us, and how we should be feeling about it, and how we can be proactive as Canadians and as a country north of the border. So without further ado, very grateful to be joined by our three panelists and leaders from the McMaster community. From closest to me to furthest, we have Dr. Don Abelson, who is the academic director of the Wilson College. He's also a professor of political science at McMaster. He's written a number of books. You should read them. He has he's also appears regularly on various media networks in Canada, the US, Europe, Middle East to discuss Canadian-US relations and US foreign policy, a bunch of other really important things that I've skipped over for now, but we're very grateful to have him. Karen Bird is a professor of political science at McMaster University from Hamilton, born and raised. She received a PhD from the University of Minnesota. Also has been involved in a number of very topical issues that we're going to talk about tonight. She's involved in the Electoral Integrity Project, which is holding a fellowship in Australia. She's also served as the commissioner on the Federal Electoral Boundaries Commission, which is an impartial body. It's drawn up the electoral districts that'll take place in our next federal election in Canada. And then on the far right here, we have Dr. Terry Flynn, who is one of Canada's leading communications management researchers. He has scholarship expertise in a number of media studies areas, professional communications, communications crisis management. He studied at Carleton University. He has, I think, over 2 decades in professional communications consulting. Before he came to McMaster, he's done a lot of great work in this space, and we're lucky to have the three of us. So just to complete, thank you. Perfect. So we'll start with Don on my right here. Don, how are you thinking about this election and its impacts on Canada? What are the big pieces that are keeping you up at night?
Well, there's a lot that generally keeps me up at night, but I think over the last several months, I've really been focused both on what's actually taking place in the race that we've all observed over the last several weeks and months, but the priorities that Canada has in the bilateral relationship. You know, John Carlo mentioned that trade is one of the defining issues for Canada, and it will always be that way. Canadian policymakers are deeply concerned that there'll be a disruption in trade, that there'll be more attacks on trade agreements that have already been signed with the United States and Mexico. This was a concern many years ago during the 2020 election, and certainly going back to 2016, When Donald Trump first threw his hat into the political ring and decided to put a target on Canada's back, mentioning time after time after time during stump speech after stump speech that the NAFTA was the worst trade deal ever negotiated. Canadian policymakers have been very concerned ever since for fear that we will lose the gains that we have made under NAFTA and now the USMCA. We're concerned about losing a partner on the world stage. Canada's stature in the world community is often enhanced by virtue of the strength of our bilateral relationship with the United States. We are concerned about issues like the environment. We know what happened when Donald Trump was first president, and in the first few days withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. We are concerned about that. We are concerned about attacks on multilateral institutions, NATO, NORAD, the United Nations. So when we think about what could happen and what might happen, we have to, and I'll talk about this later in the discussion, we need to be more proactive. We need to be more vigilant. We can no longer take for granted that America will always be on our side. And I'll end with this. When we look at the bilateral relationship, at the very least, we need to recognize that we're dealing with two independent, sovereign countries. And at times, our interests align very nicely. At other times, they don't. Canada needs to fight for every inch of political territory and political gains in the United States. It doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen even if our prime minister gets along well with the American president. It's a 24/7 full-time job, and we need to make sure that we press all the right buttons. We follow the political climate, both on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch, and that we devote the kind of attention that is necessary to maintain and strengthen our relationship. Brian Mulrooney used to say, and I worked with Mr. Mulrooney for close to 5 years, and he always said, other than the file on federal-provincial relations, the most important file a prime minister will ever have is the Canada-US file. So I've been tracking that very, very closely. I've had a lot of questions about, what are the implications of a second Trump presidency? What are the implications if Kamala Harris becomes president? The one word that sends a shiver down our spine is protectionism. The other word that should also send a shiver down our spine is isolationism. The two do not go well or bode well for us. So I'm going to stop there. I did want to thank you, before I forget, for coming out and supporting McMaster this evening and my colleagues. It's an emotional time for everyone, for Americans, for Canadians, for people around the globe. I can't remember a time when I was not immersed in American politics. I can't. My paternal grandparents were both American. My grandmother came from Kansas City, Missouri. My grandfather from Cleveland. In many ways, it's in our DNA. But it's a sensitive time. It's an emotional time. It's difficult. And what we hope to do this evening with my esteemed colleagues is to try and unpack it in an objective, fair, and educated manner. So I thank you profusely for coming to support our university, to support Wilson College. The fact that you've come out speaks volumes for your interest and level of engagement. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Bird.
So I was asked to share my reflections and what I'm watching. I'm going to talk about hope and fear. And I am an optimistic person, so I'm going to lead with hope. This may be the time that the United States elects its first female president. And I'm very hopeful about that. I have been watching as a scholar, but also just out of personal interest, the gender dynamics in politics, and I'm watching that very closely in this election. The way that women as candidates walk a tightrope between showing that they are capable of holding power, of being commander in chief. Tough enough to do that, but not so tough that they come off as unlikable. Um, and I think Kamala Harris walks that tightrope very well. I am optimistic as well because over time, more women are walking that tightrope comfortably and successfully. And we are seeing that as more women come up through party nominations. And here we have a female vice president of the United States. So it is a moment for optimism. Now, it is very difficult. So, putting my political science hat on, it's very difficult to disentangle what voters think about women as candidates in terms of their gender and gender biases that are still with us versus their attitudes towards the party and the issues that they stand for. Those things are very entangled in the United States, as here, but especially in the United States. But political scientists don't have any evidence that gender is prohibitive at the ballot box. And that's because most voters vote on the basis of party, both in the US and in Canada. That doesn't mean that gender bias and sexism isn't very prevalent. It is, but it's more in the way that female candidates, navigate the expectations and hurdles of the campaign, that walking that tightrope. If Kamala Harris wins this election, it'll be because of the mobilization of women voters and young voters and people of color, particularly African Americans. And so that's also, if that happens, this is empowerment, and so there is reason to be optimistic. And I think sometimes in the midst of all of the chaos, frankly, of this election campaign and so much information, I think it's important to remember that this is a really unprecedented moment. Yeah, we saw that into 2016 and we didn't get there, but this may be the moment. That's my hope. My fear is electoral violence. My fear is that there is going to potentially be quite a bit of chaos on November 5th and for some time after. We know that the polling in the swing states is within the margin of error. It is going to be very close, and we're likely not going to know on November 5th what the results are. And so there may be, on November 5th, there may be violence or attempts to disrupt the electoral process. There will almost certainly be long, protracted legal battles afterwards. And that is concerning because that really goes to the core problem, which is the instability, continued instability of U.S. politics and U.S. society. I'm concerned because I think everybody should be concerned about the state and health of democracy in the United States, the leader of the free world. But to come back to the relevance to Canada, it is especially concerning for us in Canada because we share, they're of course our closest neighbor. We share the same social media landscape. And I'll be talking later, I think, about what that social media landscape is doing in terms of contributing to polarization and deepening divisions, not just in the US, but also trickling into Canada. And we have an effective closeness to our U.S. neighbors. I mean, as Don mentioned, many Canadians have friends, have family members living there, and so we are more, I think, personally affected by the implications for democracy, for the state, the health of the U.S. democracy in Canada, than many other countries are. So, hope and fear.
Terry?
I share your hope, and I hope that those things that you talked about don't happen. But I think realistically, I think the world is being primed for what I am calling the next category 5 hurricane called Domala. And Domala will hit us over the next 2 weeks. We'll see surges of disinformation, deep fakes. already the questioning of the legitimacy of the election as a prime framing by the Republicans to question the the rightful election of a Democratic candidate if that happens. I think we're talking a multi-billion-dollar election, more than they are spending in Super Bowls on this. And so I think we just have to be prepared that if you thought you've seen everything, you ain't seen nothing yet, because one side of it is going to be desperately clinging to anything that they can to install fear amongst their electorate to get people out to vote, because we now know that it is within a 2% margin that this will happen. And so where are those people? And those are apparently the undecided. It reminds me of a survey. We did a reputation survey in Canada a number of years ago. We found that 2% of Canadians had never heard of Tim Hortons before, which I just really find hard to believe. So there's 2% of the Americans that are undecided at this point, at this really important, time. I've been studying media in the United States for more than 60 years. Now I see a lot of people probably of similar age that could name Irv Weinstein as the newscaster in Buffalo, right? That grew up watching Promo the Robot and on Rocket Ship 7. And so we are part of the American media ecosystem, as we get a majority of our news, whether we like it or not, directly through our contact with the American media or through Canadian media who pick it up as well. We know that the Canadian media will be paying particular attention to this because of what Don and Karen had talked about, the consequential nature of this election. And so all of our lead anchors will be down there. I don't know how long they'll be there. It's a pretty costly event. But the media vortex will continue to swamp us and overwhelm us. So I think you've got to be prepared for that. I think how do we recover from this in terms of if everybody has their positionality being on one side of the divide versus the other after November 5th, after January 20th next year, how do you in fact try to find ways to normal through truth, trust? It's going to be a really difficult time. So I'm eager to hear your perspectives, but also eager to engage with my colleagues here.
Thanks very much, Terry. Maybe we'll just start with you and we'll work our way back, because you're talking about the media landscape and information, which I think has been a pretty big topic for a lot of folks over the last little while, not just in the election, but just in general. I think a lot of folks in this room can agree it's overwhelming. Turning on the news, listening to podcasts, TikTok, Instagram, everything. The amount of information, disinformation, and also the amount of resources being put behind information, disinformation is overwhelming and has a real impact, as you've noted. I saw a post by a geopolitical observer that I follow the other day. It said, democracy was never made to withstand this combination of money and disinformation. How does that make you feel? How much truth is there to that? And how should we think about the role of financial power in the information that helps us make our democratic system work?
Well, I think we have to be thankful here in Canada that we do have spending limits that allow some level of guardrails in terms of spending. It doesn't mean that there isn't, before a writ is dropped, that a lot of money can be spent that we don't know where it's from. And so I think you're seeing some of that already with the media buys that are happening from the Conservative Party of Canada. I think they're trying to flood the airwaves as well, trying to frame the issue. Their messages are very simplistic in terms of bringing it home, cut the tax, build the houses. So I think, that costs a lot of money to buy that kind of money. So money is having an influence greater than it's probably had in other elections. So, that's an important part of it. And to be able to draw some lines to where that money is coming from. My fear is that money is coming from some of the same dark money that's happening in the United States. So they're gaining access to some levels of huge information or money. Well, we see also Elon Musk's, sort of carrot and stick kind of way with hand, tabling out $1 million to get people to sign up as well. Uh, yeah, I think the money in the United States is obscene. I think if we think of the amount of money that is being spent and what social problems we could actually tackle with that. But you'll never get Americans to agree to any kind of constraints on that. That's their freedom of speech. You can't legislate freedom of speech, and so that has an influence just in terms of what they can do. The also thing is that what networks are working with them to be able to interfere with this, and in terms of the social media campaigns that are happening and where that is coming from as well. So I have over the next 2 weeks, I think you will see something that we've never seen before. That's hurricane levels.
And Karen, this discussion around information and ad buys and influence over how we should think about this party, that party, all of this, then you bring in on top of that layered on discussions around like a rigged election and all of these pieces as well. The state of democracy also is built on the electoral process. And when you have, more folks that are uneasy or worried about the state of the electoral process, that has implications as well for the state of democracy. So how are you thinking about the level? And can you tell us, like, how many people in the U.S. do you know are worried about the election and the electoral integrity and things like this? And how moderated should we think about this? It's the year of elections. We just had, first female premier in New Brunswick elected yesterday. We're going through BC's recount. There's a process for this as well. So we have an electoral process in here, but a lot of people are uneasy about the electoral process in the US. So how are we thinking about that?
Yeah. So, the big lie, right? The big lie. Let's call it's the big lie. But a lot of people have been persuaded by the big lie that the election was rigged. It was mentioned that I have worked on this thing called the Electoral Integrity Project, and this is a worldwide project, and experts and academics evaluate the integrity of elections around the world. U.S. elections aren't perfect, and they score lower than Canadian elections on integrity because of the role of money, because of the role of the politically gerrymandered ridings. But they are and have long been viewed as generally free and fair. So there are problems with the elections, but it's really problems of perception more than it's problems of reality. So, in terms of equal access to the ballot, in terms of the process of vote tabulation, in terms of rule of law that oversees elections, things do work reasonably well in the U.S. And I'll say a bit more about maybe why Canada is better, but it's not at least as we look at elections around the world, it's not as broken as in many cases. Okay, so perceptions are the problem. And so where do these perceptions that the electoral system is rigged or it's broken come from? There is social media disinformation. I mean, that's definitely a real problem. There is elite cues. So what's really important is whether the elite, the political elite, are saying that there are problems with integrity. Every election will have small errors, but they balance out over the volumes, millions of ballots that are cast, so that it doesn't create a bias. But if elites want to, look at these tiny things and then blow it up into the election is rigged, the election is biased, the administrators of the election are biased, that's what creates real problems. So elite cues are really important. The other thing I would say would be this this trend of of polarization, and I want to say a little bit about the polarization in the United States. Um, there is ideological polarization, and then there's what we call political scientists call affective polarization or emotional polarization, and the the public in the United States is not as ideologically polarized as they think they are. They actually do share some views on policy issues, even hot button policy issues. There's more overlap than they think, but there's this perception that they're so different, and there's this emotional polarization. Like we used to say, well, I disagree with your political views, but let's go have a beer. Now it's I disagree with your political views, you're the enemy. And so that is driving the distrust, because once you think that the other party or the members of the other party are the enemy, then you think that they're rigging the election. They're doing everything that they can to, and that I should also specify that affective polarization exists on both sides, but it's only one side that's saying that the election is rigged. And so the other problem is low turnout, and lack of trust leads to low turnout, and then low turnout leads to lack of trust, because it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like your voice matters, so you don't vote, and then in fact, there are really just the more polarized people that are weighing in on elections. So there are a lot of things in the kind of ecosystem that are contributing to this. In Canada, on the affective polarization, we're sort of trending in the same direction, but we don't have, and we don't have elites who are saying, who are questioning the integrity of our elections. And I'm going to watch very closely what happens in British Columbia next weekend when the vote recount is done. If it's done by then, it might go to the Superior Court Justice of BC. But it is vitally important that our elites don't cross that line, because our elections are reasonable. Even in the U.S., they're reasonably well run. I will say there is no major political party in Canada that has publicly questioned the integrity of our elections. That's important. When I was a member of the Federal Boundaries Commission, an impartial body, and we have a very rigorous and fair process of adjusting boundaries in order to ensure that they have equal populations within them. There were politicians who didn't want their boundaries changed, who said that it was being gerrymandered. Those are dangerous words, right? Those are dangerous words, and the commission pushed back very hard on that kind of language. We've heard that language from our Premier of Ontario as well, in deciding not to adopt boundaries, the federal boundaries. So those are things we need to really watch out for. One thing I want to say about distrust, because this is university. You look older than most of my students, but young people don't trust elections, or I should say they have lower levels of trust in elections and lower levels of participation in elections than older people do. There is perhaps a sense among younger people that trusting the political system is, problematic, like that we should be more, resistant to elites and so on. But that can really be dysfunctional if it contributes to lower trust and lower participation.
Before I do, Terry, I want to pick up on something that Karen just said, because talking about such polarized groups in your own headspaces. I was just chatting with somebody before coming on the stage here tonight. We were talking about how in classrooms it's hard because students don't come in with the same information. You didn't all read the Globe yesterday. Nobody, we didn't all watch the same piece of news last night, and it's hard to, one, you know, facilitate dialogue where people are coming to a discussion, having the same information, and two, actually getting folks to try and listen to the person on the other side. So, Terry, how do we actually try and bridge this divide? People are coming in with completely different versions, sometimes of the truth, of different types of information. Do we just need more of these events? How do we do this? How do we bring people more to each other's side so we can, we can disagree and then go have a beer?
Well, yeah, that's another doctoral assignment. I don't know, and I don't think I don't have enough runway for that. I think that's a really difficult point. And if you look at the United States, I'm not sure that is. We had this discussion in a pre-meeting. These are all conditions for civil war. I mean, what is happening in the United States has happened in many other countries around the world where, family, my grandfather and father came to Canada in 1925 because my grandfather was on the wrong end of a party. He supported Michael Collins, and that wasn't the way that it was going to be. And so, do we face the same kind of civil war in the United States? It would be horrific. It would just be horrific. Here in Canada, I think, we need to find a way to get out of our echo chambers. The fear is that we are cocooning, right? Those echo chambers are becoming walled gardens, and that we're not allowing ourselves to, in fact, accept different or competing propositions there. And so when we continue to do that, then, sociologists would tell us the same things happen in cults. I mean, we start to, in fact, begin to believe these kinds of mythologies that are spread for the purposes of keeping the cocoon strong and able to compete as well. So, programs like this through Wilson College, through listening, through engaged sessions of roundtables to listen to one another, to find ways to find that common ground that Karen talked about. It's something that will take years to do. And my fear here in Canada is that, there's certain political parties will see tactics used by US politicians, the language that US politicians have used, the disrespect and sexism that has been used, and they're going to use that here in Canada. And so they're going to start to frame those arguments as well. And how do you get back to civility when everything has been discivil?
I want to pick up on this a little bit more in a second, but I want to shift the conversation a little bit just to the relationship between Canada and the U.S., Don. Canada seems to be on its own track a little bit. It seems these days like we're kind of on our own little geopolitical path. We're not really following what the U.S. is doing. We're not really following what a lot of the world is doing. But the world's changing and the U.S. is changing, and it feels like oftentimes there's very little we can do except for watch these changes happening around us.
Right.
We're talking about like a potential 2% margin of error between two very different potential U.S. presidents coming into power. What does being proactive for either option mean? What does Canada potentially mattering more in our relationship mean? I was saying earlier, like we can't pick up Canada and move Canada, and it doesn't matter how you feel about the US. You don't have to be friends, but we are neighbors. We're biggest trading partners. How do we matter more to prepare for either outcome?
Right. So great question. I mean, Karen referred to a tightrope in her introductory remarks about, women and the difficulties they have. Prime ministers in Canada have always had to walk a tightrope in their relationship with the United States. You can go back to the early 1970s, Mitchell Sharp, the White Paper, and what was Pierre Trudeau thinking about? How do we reduce our dependency on the United States? The third option was about, do we enter into more formal trade agreements with other countries around the world? How do we become less vulnerable? The power asymmetry between Canada and the United States is so massive that we're not going to be able to close that gap. So if we are, as Pierre Trudeau replied or referenced, the mouse living beside the elephant, how do we survive? How do we thrive? One of the problems that Canada has had, and I'm glad that I saw, Justin Trudeau make the right decision in this regard, that he established a cabinet level committee several years ago to focus on the Canada-US relationship. And one of the things that we've taken for granted in Ottawa is that, well, we have such a special relationship with the United States, we don't have to jump through the kind of hoops that other states do. Not true. When Americans think about the special relationship they enjoy, here's a spoiler alert. It's not us.
Right.
Their special relationship is with the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
So when we talk about special relationship, and the Americans talk about a special relationship, we're coming at it from two very different perspectives. Do we have an enduring partnership? Yeah, we do. Do we go through ups and downs depending on the issue and who's occupying the Oval Office and who's at 24 Sussex? Yeah, we do. Do we have some prime ministers that are better navigating the Canada-US relationship than others? We certainly have. But the relationship itself relies so much on trade, on geography, on the ability of Canada to establish a stronger voice. And you think about it. For years, we've been seen as a middle power, not a principal power, not a modest power, a middle power. Our stature on the world stage grows when we have a strong relationship with the United States. We saw that through the Mulroney-Reagan, Mulroney-Bush years. We've seen it at other times. When we speak with one voice, Canada does remarkably well. When we're at odds with Washington, there are various ways that Washington can punish us for it. Getting back to your question about what do we do to be more proactive? What does that actually look like? Well, if we can't take for granted that we're always going to receive positive concessions from the United States, we have to strengthen our presence, not only in Washington, D.C., but in the various state capitals. Approximately 30 states, 30 out of 50 states, recognize Canada as their largest trading partner. Why are we not doing more in state legislatures? Why are we not meeting more often with state governors? Regardless of the outcome in a couple of weeks or 2.5 weeks, could be 2.5 months, I don't know. But regardless of the outcome, our primary interests are not going to change. So what can we do? We change our strategy. We don't bury our heads in the sand. We don't wait for the political storms to, go over. We think about what we can do strategically. We work with civil society actors. My area of expertise is think tanks. That's what I studied. Out of the 400 think tanks or public policy research centers in the United States, in DC, 400, only 2 of them have any interest in Canada. 2 out of 400. We need to work with business councils. We need to work with advocacy coalitions. We need to make Canada a stronger presence. A colleague of mine runs the Canada Institute in Washington. The bulk of their money comes from American businesses owned by Canadians. Try and raise money for think tanks in Canada. Good luck. The budget of the Heritage Foundation, and you've heard a lot about the Heritage Foundation in recent months because of Project 2025. That's a whole other lecture, which I would love to give. The annual budget of the Heritage Foundation is over $130 million US. You count up every think tank in Canada, they can't even compete with that single budget. So it's a different landscape. We need to work more closely with universities. The Canadian government needs to work more closely with other types of NGOs who do a lot of work with Canada and in Canada. But the last thing that we can take for granted is that this relationship will always net positive results for us. Do I see us ever going it alone? No, I don't. We can't afford to do that. But can we be smarter? Can we be more aggressive? We take such comfort in being so polite and staying in our own lane. I often begin speeches in the United States when I talk about Canada-US relations by remarking or asking, why did the Canadian cross the street? to get to the middle of the road. We need to, I always like that. We have to adopt a different strategy, a different mentality. We can be more competitive. We are smart people, but we cannot play America's game. We've got to institute our own.
Lot of insights there, and I'm going to invite our other panelists to feel free to jump in on this as well. But I'm going to follow up, Don, because you touched on a bunch of different ways that we can strengthen our relationship, very Mulrooney like, that we can strengthen our relationship with the U.S. I'm going to drop two nuggets for you to maybe pick up on as well, to maybe get a little bit more acute. Two things that matter a lot to the U.S. Being trade
Yep.
and security. We have a third ocean, the North,
Yep.
or the Arctic as well, that is mattering more and more these days. Could be one way that maybe we can try and, I think our 2% towards NATO actually would count. I think if we put it towards the Arctic, which is a little tidbit. But the other one, there's a lot happening these days on the auto sector. And when we think about, worst case scenario, when you talk about tariffs, the 10% tariff, what could that mean? I've seen estimates of like 3.8% impact on our GDP. Save the fact that I think interprovincial trade barriers might be about 4%. But how do you think we can, on either of those two, matter more to the U.S.? You've talked a lot about think tanks, talked a lot about individual state legislatures, but how do we try and matter more to the U.S. in terms of what the U.S. needs? And you talked about we're a middle power.
Yeah.
We're not going to become the elephant in the relationship. We're going to, for the foreseeable future, remain the mouse. So how do we matter more in terms of what the U.S. needs so that they don't see the U.K. as the special relationship they see us?
Right. So I think what we can do is help our allies on Capitol Hill, in the executive, in the state legislatures, reconstruct the narrative around the Canada-US relationship. The pitch that Americans will listen to is how they benefit even more than we do. And they are actually harming themselves more than they are harming us. They look at trade, they look at Arctic sovereignty, which is an ongoing issue, right? That famous picture of Mulrooney pointing to a globe in his office when Reagan was visiting and saying, you see that area? That's ours. That's the Arctic. We own it. We need to play that game. And we need to convince American policymakers that what you're doing is actually counterproductive. What you're doing with respect to slapping on tariffs, what you're doing with respect to softwood lumber, which you have tried now countless times, what you have done or what you contemplate doing with respect to the Buy American plans and other things, what you have decided to do with respect to the Keystone XL pipeline, a decision that Biden made on his first day in office. And Canadians were so excited, right? Democratic president, over 88% of Canadians, if they had the right to vote, would have voted for Biden and Harris. We don't have the right to vote. Not there. But on his first day in office, what does Biden do? He announces Buy American and he kills Keystone XL. So then all of a sudden we're looking in the mirror saying, well, we thought you were our friends. We thought you were allies. No. Our relationship with the United States does not give us a free pass. If anything, it should force us to think more along their lines. Why do they do what they do? Because it benefits them. How do we construct a narrative so they are convinced that trying to impose tariffs and other things on us will hurt us more than them? Not so. But we need to construct those arguments. And as Terry pointed out before, that message needs to be reinforced,
right,
time and time again. So again, it's about communications. It's about relationship building. It's about professional networks. And it's maintaining a consistent message. If the Americans see us being weak, if they see us being more than happy to make concessions before we're even asked to make concessions, then they know, we should know we're being played. Let's stop being played. And let me just, if I could, make one quick point that both Terry and Karen talked about. There's been so much focus on Trump and Harris. Well, that's to be expected. They're the two people vying for the most important office in the free world. What are we not talking about? What we're not talking about is what happens after the election. And what we haven't quite come to terms with is that in 2020, 75 million people supported Donald Trump. Even after leaving office, albeit reluctantly, a former president was not only able to hold on to his base, but he became the titular head of the Republican Party. I've never seen that in my lifetime. So regardless of who wins, what we're now facing, and Terry more than alluded to this, is two tectonic plates moving toward each other, one represented by the Democrats, the other by the Republicans. And for those of you who took first year geology, I did, it gets to a point that a lot of energy is going to be released. And what we know is neither party is prepared to give up some ground to find common ground. So when Terry talked, and Karen alluded to this as well, fear of violence, I worry about that. I will be in Washington, D.C. on election day. And I will be able to observe certain things. So if I go into witness protection, you'll know why. But that's what I worry about. I worry that these tectonic plates come together, that no one is prepared to make concessions. And my last point is this. It was not long ago, I was an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto and observed the 1984 US presidential election. Ronald Reagan's second term, he won 49 of 50 states. He only lost Minnesota to his running mate, Walter Mondale, from Minnesota, and he lost 3 electoral votes from the District of Columbia. Over the last 4 presidential elections, we haven't seen anything close to that. And as Karen knows better than most, the margin of error is so small. The leads seem to be changing hands by the hour. It will come down to a single state. And what some people haven't thought about is what if neither one achieves 270 electoral votes? You have a tie. That gets thrown into the House of Representatives, courtesy of the 12th Amendment back in 1804. Last time that happened was in 1824. At this point, I don't think we can rule out anything.
Before we turn over to audience questions, you see some QR codes up here. If you have a question, feel free to point your camera at that, submit a question. I have an iPad, I'll get your question. Just wanted to ask Karen on that last piece. There's a lot that could happen over the next little bit, a lot of worrying things, a lot of things that sound catastrophic. What in your head is the test of electoral discipline and integrity? Is it violence? Is it that the party that won as the party that is in office, and if there is violence as well, like, can you tell us a little bit about, like, what do you consider the test in terms of, if we hit these things, the electoral process is still safe, it's rocky, but it's still there, just to help us kind of moderate how we're going to see the next few weeks roll into us?
Well, I think the key thing is peaceful transfer of power. It's peaceful transfer of power. It's losers consent. So, I mean, I started off saying, like, that U.S. elections have themselves, the way they've been run, been good, but it's all about perception. So it is peaceful transfer of power and losers consent, and that's we have good reason to be worried about that. I will say there was a report that came out by like an office of the government called Horizons. I wrote it down and I can't remember it now. Policy Horizons Canada on disruptions on the horizon, and they listed 35 things that Canadians should be worried about disruptions. And they did. This came out in the summer. Said civil war was not highly plausible. But there are other things that we should be worried about, like people can't tell what is true and what's not true, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Billionaires run the world. These are things that the Policy Horizons Canada says we should be worried about. We we have good electoral integrity in Canada, and uh, elections administration bodies like Elections Canada are amongst the most trusted institutions in Canada, and that is excellent. That's a sort of a bulwark against the kinds of things that we're seeing in the U.S. I'll say, I'm not maybe going to answer your question directly, but what I think we can do in Canada that also gives me hope and I think allows us to think concretely about what are the things that we need to do to avoid the things that are happening south of the border. We need to, so the reason that the American politicians are so ideologically polarized and they are creating a more emotionally polarized electorate is because of institutions, the way that certain things work in like the primaries, for example, where just the most partisan people vote. So we can think about, and political scientists are thinking about things to change in our institutional structures so that we disincentivize politicians from amplifying the polarization. And that there's lots of things that we can think about. We can think about electoral reform. We can think about our own nomination processes within the parties. And then at the more micro level, because I'm a teacher, I talk to my students. I use this wonderful book that I highly recommend. It's a graphic version, an illustrated version of Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, 20 Lessons for the 20th Century. And there are 20 lessons about what we can do as individuals to be good citizens. And they're simple things. They're put the phone down, look people in the eye, investigate, respect facts, don't spread misinformation. And we talk in the class about things that we can do individually to protect not just the integrity of our elections, but the health of our democracy. I want to end on a positive note.
If I can add just one
please.
more thing, I think that what Canadians can do is to find ways to support a healthy professional field of journalism.
Oh, yeah.
We've lost a radio station here. We have areas of the country that are news deserts. We need to invest in local civic journalism. We have to encourage and encourage journalists to hold politicians accountable. It's been their traditional role, to be able to ask questions and ask them tough questions, but to really hold them accountable. And right now, I think we're in jeopardy of losing funding from the CBC and other media outlets as well, with concentration by larger companies as well. So I think finding ways to be engaged, to be active, to make comments, to support, to have your subscriptions still, whether digital or hard copy, and to be active, engaged citizens in the news.
Thanks very much. As you've been speaking, I've been getting lots of questions into my inbox. I'm gonna take two, and I'll ask whoever wants to pick up on either of these. I've gotten a question about the youth vote and the mature vote. On the youth vote side, how do you see younger generations in terms of the influence of the election? Some folks voting for the first time, or folks in Canada who are younger watching what's happening in the US, and then we have our own election in Canada coming up in the next who knows how many months or year. And then on the flip side, how can senior citizens as well contribute to the fight against disinformation? A lot of senior citizens are on social media apps as well. How, pick either one if you'd like, but yeah, if you guys want to speak on those. Terry?
Can I speak for the youth vote? Because I think that's what I am now.
Yes.
I just turned 65.
It's
Yeah. Got my first CPP check last month, so I want to talk about the youth vote. I don't, that term senior citizen, just no. How can mature voters get engaged? My age people, how many people like look at TikTok? How many people have TikTok accounts? I mean, that's where I just came from a class of third, fourth year communication studies. That's where they get their news from. So how are you contributing to that? How are you encouraging your grandchildren? Mine is just 11 months old, so she's listening a bit, but not that much. But how are you encouraging them to be engaged, to participate in, working for Elections Canada or Elections Ontario in that respect, or be involved in political parties? So I think that's how seniors can be, ensure that we have a continuity of not just governments, but of leadership and respect for that.
Either of you want to go to the next one?
Well, I'll just say, I mean, youth turnout we know is very low. It's low, and it's declining. And it's so youth today vote at lower rates than youth did 20 years ago. So it's not just a generational thing where once you buy a house and have a kid and you're more invested, then you'll vote. It's not that. It is something about this cohort. So it is likely to move with this cohort. And the other thing we know is that the first voting experience is the most important. So if you vote when you're 18, you'll vote. You're more likely to vote for the rest of your life. But if you don't, it doesn't. It's about instilling the habit. And one of the things I tell my students is, these when we run elections, they love hiring students who know how to use the tablets and can deal with any technical problems. So I kind of promote this as democracy is hiring. They want young people. There are not just short-term career, job opportunities. There are career opportunities, and also make it part of your civic way of life, right? That democracy is important to you.
Another question that came in, I think we're going to get some mics going as well. So if you didn't submit your questions in the QR codes, you can keep thinking of your questions. But the other question I saw that came in from a student is on voter fraud. The question is, and take this if you'd like on face or perception or what, but why do you think there is perceived or real more voter fraud in the US versus Canada? Do you expect similar concerns in the next Canadian election? How should this, Karen, I think this is your alley. So how?
Yeah, I'm having trouble.
Oh, sorry. I have two mics and neither of them are capturing. Can you hear me now? Is this? How's this? Sorry. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna re-ask that question to Karen. The question is from a current student, and it is on voter fraud. And this individual's asked why we think there might be more voter fraud in the U.S. versus Canada, and do we expect similar concerns in the next Canadian election? How should this student be thinking about this?
So my answer is that voter fraud is a misperception. It's a So this is picking up on the social media or the the information bubbles. As I said, like election administrators in the U.S., even though it is they have some different challenges than we have in Canada because election administrative bodies are run by the counties. So I think Pennsylvania has 77 different election administrators. So we're advantaged in Canada because it's very centralized. We have large capacity and ability to effectively run those elections and deal with problems. So voter fraud is not a problem in Canada, not a problem. No evidence of voter fraud. Also, we know no systematic evidence of voter fraud in the U.S. Some random errors, but that even out and that don't have an impact on the results of the election. So I don't know. Maybe I'm misreading the question, but I want to tell this a student who's asked this great question. The response to voter fraud is that you get in there and you correct the misinformation.
I didn't want to pick up on that point, but the previous point. about youth engagement, which is really one of the major reasons why Wilson College was established. We need to remind young people coming into the program that the right to vote, the luxury to vote, did not come easily to many people, that they have a civic responsibility to cast a vote and to get off the couch and put down the phone and understand what's at stake. You know, when you look at the sacrifices that women have made over time, my wife is here and is a historian and teaches about this. When you think about the right to vote given to Blacks in the United States and the hardships that they went through, there is no excuse for not exercising your civic responsibility. And the students that we are going to attract to this program, which I could not be more excited about, are students who feel passion and compassion, who understand the sacrifices that people have made to give them an opportunity to weigh in on some of the principal challenges. So I don't buy the argument for 1 second that, oh, well, I've got too much to do. No, 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 no. Voting is a time for reflection. It's a time for reasserting your values and preferences. And if you're old enough to go to university, if you're old enough to drive a car, you're certainly old enough to cast a vote.
I don't want to start another chapter of our discussion, but I was in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2014 during their federal general election. It's mandatory voting there. Everybody has to vote there.
Correct.
So to what degree if voter turnout continues to go so dangerously low,
Yeah.
then at what point does the government then say, no, it's mandatory? And there was no violence. There was a very tough election. That was when Dilma was elected. Very difficult election, but there was no violence and people did their job and there were.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you for indulging me in my questions and some of these virtual questions. Wondering, are we good to do some mics? Perfect. So if anybody in the crowd, if you have a question that you'd like to ask broadly for one of our panelists to pick up, or if you've heard something tonight that you'd like to ask a further question on, feel free to just raise your hand and we can bring a mic to you if you'd like to ask your question. Right here.
Made about the fears around this certainly resonate. And the point was really a good one that was made about Trump isn't the problem. It's the 75 million people who think and for whom his message resonates. And I'm wondering if there's any comment. There's a school of thought that says these ideas, these opinions were always there or for many years, but it's become acceptable now to voice them. So I'm interested in any comments as far as that is concerned.
Yeah, first of all, it's a great question, and you've hit the nail on the head. I've often said two things about the Trump presidency going back to 2016. Trump would never have been elected if the United States was not prepared for him. The conditions had to be in place in order to allow him to be elected. Secondly, in terms of, and again, I don't want to turn this into a partisan debate, but in terms of the Trump legacy, and I'm not going to talk about trade or foreign policy or the perfect phone call in Ukraine. I'm not going to talk about that. But I'll tell you one thing, that what Trump did in 2016, sworn into office in 2017, was to give millions of Americans who felt disillusioned, disheartened, angry, bitter, license to remove their filters and to say whatever they wanted to say and harm whoever they wanted to harm and disparage whoever they wanted to disparage. I remember at that time, my son coming home from high school. This was within a week of the 2016 election. And I said, "How was your day?" And he said, "Well, it wasn't great." I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, a lot of the young girls in my history class were being screamed at, and the guys were saying really vulgar and inappropriate things." And I said, why is that? And he said, well, they feel that they have more agency now that Trump has won and that it's well within their right to say it. And I said, and what did you do? They said, well, I didn't do anything. I said, that needs to change. We have a problem not only in the United States, but in Canada, politicians seeing the world through the lens of left and right instead of right and wrong. And we've got to get back to a point where we have general consensus that doing certain things is just dead wrong. And until we can get to that place, we can talk about policies until the cows come home. We can have disagreements about infrastructure. We can talk about education. We can talk about healthcare. We can talk about anything you want. And I assure you, I could close my eyes and point to anyone in this audience, and I have no doubt that we could sit down and have a really engaging conversation. I have a family member, a very close family member. We share the same blood, who became a red meat Republican when Trump was elected. I almost lost my relationship with her because of it. So let's not just focus on the policies. I mean, they're of course important. When did character and integrity stop making a difference? To me, that's what's on the ballot. It's not about Trump and Harris. Where has the United States come? Where are they going? And whatever happened to character? Whatever happened to the importance of integrity? So your question, I think, just really encapsulates how people feel. That why is it that any of us, and most of us are perfect strangers, can sit down and grab a coffee at Tim Hortons and talk about anything you want. And we'll shake hands and we might disagree, but that's okay. That's what a democracy is all about. A democracy is not about identifying entire groups of people and scapegoating them. We lived through those times. We saw what the results were. They were catastrophic. We don't do that. So why are we sitting back and allowing it?
And I was just going to add to that, and I agree completely with what you've said, Don, but I do think also it sheds a light on status anxiety in the US. I mean, a long history of racism and exclusion that is the tide is turning. And so there are people who feel anxious and upset about that. And the social economic inequalities that are growing. I mentioned that one of the things that Policy Horizons Canada suggests we should worry about is billionaires running the world. And so those swing states, that are within a hair's breadth, are Rust Belt states, right? I mean, there are people who do feel like they are economically suffering. And so part of the thing that we have to think about, right, with this is not to forgive or allow the kind of incivility that we're seeing, which is completely unacceptable. But we do have to address the social inequalities and the longstanding racial inequalities that are at the heart of the status anxiety and the dissatisfaction that Trump has been able to mobilize.
I think the conditions are ripe for that kind of action to happen here in Canada. If you saw, the truckers' convoy did not go away. It's still on Highway 2 in Alberta. The issues that are being spoken of resonate with a great many people, and the disenfranchised people, the young who can't get into the housing market anymore, who can't, a friend of mine's daughter and her friends have rented an apartment in Toronto. They had to put down $56,000 in advance, prepay a year's worth of rent. How did people, so if you're 25 and you're entering the workforce and you thought when 18 interest rates were 18%, that it was really hard. It's worse today. And so I think it's prime. And if somebody is going to take advantage of them, they're going to use that language. It also goes back to our parliamentarians. who are using uncivilized language and tactics as well. And so finding ways to get respect back. My dad was a member of parliament for Kitchener from 1974 to 79. One of his good friends was, he was liberal, and one of his good friends was Sean O'Sullivan from here in Hamilton. He counseled Sean to actually leave politics and become a priest. He used to have a great relationship with many people across the aisle. But that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, if you're seen to make friends with the other side of the aisle, you're marked in your own caucus that way. So I think we have to think about party politics, ensuring that their civility begins in the House and the legislatures, so that they role model what we want to, in fact, politicians to be. What? No laughing for that? Come on.
Or up there, yeah.
What the hell?
We'll come back. We'll come back.
Thank you. I think the thing that disturbs me the most is the realization that the Republican Party of the United States was the party that ended slavery, was the party that introduced a surprising number of social advances that might never have risen by the time they put it in place. Is there any chance at all that over some period of time, the Republican Party will revive itself and become a political party that we're more familiar with? Or is it the case this is a change that is permanent?
It's a fascinating question, because clearly there are huge divisions within the Republican Party between the Trump Republicans, Reagan Republicans. What bothers me most, not most, but what really bothers me is when Trump constantly compares himself to Reagan. He was nothing like Ronald Reagan. I'm not even convinced Trump is a Republican. I don't think he knows what he is, to be honest. Right. So can they get back to a point where you have civility, where there's a focus more on policy instead of personalities? I had the good fortune years ago, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., and both John McCain and Joe Lieberman were speaking. And I arrived late. I was at the door. John McCain finished his speech. He came down and he was standing right beside me. I'm like, oh my God, I'm right beside John McCain. I put out my hand, I shake his, told him what an honor it was to meet him, and it was. And then, Joe Lieberman came about 10 minutes later, shook his hand. And people often forget that in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for the presidency against John McCain, who did John McCain want to run on the bottom half of the ticket? His friend Joe Lieberman, a Democrat from Connecticut. And it was Joe Lieberman who said, and John McCain was his very best friend, as much as I would love to, I can't, because I'm going to destroy your chances. Those days are pretty much done. And it's disturbing to me, because over the years, there have been many prominent Republicans. The Republican Party used to be the party of principle, party of law and order, party that felt that no one was above the law, ultra vires above law. No one was above the law. What mattered the most was the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, how people were treated. Bipartisanship not only happened, it happened regularly. And that's why I made the point about my fear of these two tectonic plates moving toward each other and neither side prepared to give up ground. That's not a recipe for success. That's a recipe for disaster. Will the Republican Party ever reinvent itself? Let's hope they move to a more moderate position. But here's the thing, and I know Karen in her political science courses would talk about this as well. When you're running in an election, you tend to try and, you might find yourself, on the extremes, or, you're moving right or you're moving left. When you're in office, you're moving to the center. It's not happening. It's just not. So that middle ground, that moderate political class, it's gone. Am I hopeful that it will return? I think it's going to take a major political event to force people to do that, but we'll see.
Yeah, and I would just go back to it is a function of certain institutions within the parties, the nomination processes that have created this. And it reflects something quite different than where actually ordinary Americans stand on policy issues. So, the, the hope is to sort of figure out what were those changes in those systems, how can we change them back, and maybe hope that again, people believe that they're more ideologically opposed to each other than they are. But if they actually can sit down and talk about some of these issues, there's policy, there's overlap in their attitudes. So maybe a dose of hope in that. Uh, yeah, okay. A dose of hope, just a little dose of hope.
Right. He has a question right here as well. Oh, okay.
I'm curious about what happens when we look at the like historical economic effects that have kind of been imported, maybe for lack of a better term, or influenced in Canada from our relationships with the United States, with the UK, economic historical shifts that have led to the kind of relative deprivation that has influenced the current polarizations that we're seeing? Are there ways that we can look back at those economic shifts to inspire changes to make today? What sort of changes can we revert? Maybe is there anything there for us to look at?
Do you want to take? This one? I don't know. I'm not really an expert in that area of social policy, but I mean, I would just say this may sound just simple, but I think we have to take seriously people's um, uh, uh, this feeling they're not doing as well as they used to be, and we have to figure out a way um, to have a better equalization of our basic resources. I mean, we're a wealthy country in Canada. We're a wealthy country. We can do better in terms of the distribution of that wealth. And that sounds ideological, but the point here is to say that when people feel like they're dispossessed, that they can't afford, they'll never be able to afford a home. They don't feel like they're any party has a solution to that. They're not going to vote. So there is a series of these factors that can spiral into something quite problematic. And so, yeah, I don't know that I have policy solutions in mind, but I think that we do need to take seriously, and we're in Hamilton, also a post-industrial city, that people have shelter, that people have a roof over their heads. We are a wealthy country. We have to figure out a way with, multi-levels of government to ensure that people have a minimum safety net.
One of the things I think your question was alluding to is how can Canada both insulate itself and potentially benefit from economic changes in the United States? So we'd have to look at that through a sector by sector analysis. We would have to look, of course, at what results the free trade agreement has had for Canadians and Americans. Has there been a net gain, net loss? Our economies are so inextricably linked that what happens in the United States invariably is going to affect us here. Having said that, we have still, as a sovereign country, been able to hold on to a distinct political culture, our own history, our own values, and our own preferences. It has not always been easy. But one of the greatest concerns going back to the 1980 discussion over free trade was that Canada would lose its identity. that if we assimilate more with the United States, if we integrate more with the United States, Canadian nationalists feared that we would be absorbed into the American, monolith. There's so many different things that we could talk about to help differentiate us from our American friends and colleagues and cousins. In many ways, our values might overlap, but in other ways, they're very, very different. When you watch TV or online and find out about the last mass shooting in the United States, and you're upset for about 24, 48 hours, and then it blows over until the next one, then the next one. When we think about healthcare, when we think about millions of Americans who walk around with either inadequate insurance or no insurance, I cannot fathom that. So in many ways, again, going back to what Karen said in her introductory remarks, there's a tightrope. We want the benefits of integrating with the United States without the costs that come with it. And so we've got to keep a lot of balls up in the air at the same time. So are there ways that we can insulate ourselves? We can, but we have to assess the costs of doing that.
You can say soon, it's okay. I can also prefer.
I don't know if you agree with my mind. In my opinion, the whole West, including the US and Canada, are repeating the downfall of the Roman Empire, whose diseases or problems before its termination are shared by the whole West. To confront such a crisis, the whole West in different countries offered different answers. In Belgium and Austria, ultra-rightist parties were elected. Then in France, the leftist one was chosen. So I don't know if this is the very value of democracy. We know that ultra-rightist parties do not favor democracy. And I wonder, maybe you can give some prophecy about the choices of the American people and the Canadian people will choose in their respective elections. Thank you very much.
God, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be a wealthy man. Let's deal with the Canadian side, and Karen and Terry can weigh in on this. We've gone through different periods in our history when we've seen a large segment of the population move more toward the right, and then we've seen them move more toward the left. Things are not looking great, obviously, for Justin Trudeau at this point. Every prime minister has an expiry date, and many people feel that he's well beyond his. Again, it's not my perspective, but a perspective that many Canadians share. I think there'll be less likelihood that Canada would move to an extreme right position. That I don't see, despite the fact that there are pockets in this country. That I do not see. And in the United States, again, what I worry about is those 75 million people who voted in 2020 for Donald Trump have not gone quietly into that good night. If anything, they've become more emboldened. And I want to make this clear. I'm not anti-conservative. I'm not. There are lots of conservative principles I could say we can have a healthy discussion about. Where I come down is on the character and integrity of the person who could end up occupying the most important office in the free world. I think there's a greater tendency in the United States to move They have over the past 20 years. What's going to stop it? I have no idea. But it's a republic, flows directly from the people. That's what the framers of the Constitution constructed. It's a republic. And ultimately, Americans who have the right to vote have to decide what kind of country that they want. It's easy for me, as a Canadian born in Ottawa, Ontario, to weigh in. I don't have the right to vote in the United States. I don't live in the United States. I understand the concerns of the United States, but only Americans can decide their fate and their destiny. And if they truly believe, a majority, that they are going to be better off with a Donald Trump in office, that's their call. It's not ours. Do I think it's the wrong call? 100%, but it's their call.
Yeah, and I was just going to, my thoughts go to, there is nothing inherently anti-democratic about the rise of right-wing and even extreme right-wing parties. We see democracies around the world that have right and far-right parties, and they have elections where power is transferred peacefully, that the public can decide when it is time to get rid of that party and replace it with another party. So when it crosses the line is when a party of any ideological position does not agree to the principles of a liberal democracy. But there are lots of right-wing parties that are not posing a threat to democracy. So we also have to be careful, right, about how we characterize other parties. And again, be careful with our words, be careful with the thoughtful about what we're talking about. And because that kind of lack of care and thinking about what democracy means can, again, like spiral into this deeper polarization, right? We can, and as a democracy, as members of a democracy, we need to be able to sit down across the table with somebody who doesn't share our ideological beliefs, with somebody with whom we might disagree with, and have a conversation with them. That's what a healthy democracy is about.
And I think can you hear me? Test. I think we could probably keep going for another hour, but we're going to call it there. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dean Hurley. So thank you so much for listening to us, and over to Dean Hurley to take it away. Thank you.
So thank you very much to the panelists and to Giancarlo. So can we give him a round of applause? It was a great discussion, learned a lot, and I hope you all did too. And I hope you walk away feeling like you understand at least some aspects of this better. And as maybe as Karen said, I can be at least hopeful about some parts, even if other parts are not so hopeful. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time in your evening to come out and join us for this, both in person and virtually. As was mentioned, there's a number of people here virtually. Your engagement is really important to us. It's very crucial for these conversations as we navigate these issues, both of the U.S. election and, of course, has been mentioned, upcoming Canadian elections, which are not very far off on the horizon and will face, to greater or lesser degrees, some of the same challenges, I suspect. I want to invite all those who are here in person to join us in the atrium after, just in a few moments, for reception and further discussion around these interesting and important issues. And there will also be representatives of Wilson College who can help answer your questions and help you understand what the Wilson College Initiative is, which is just started recently at McMaster and is really taking shape nicely as one of our newest programs and newest components of the university. So thank you again, and please join us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you.